Hello and welcome back to the Everyday Christian Podcast. I'm your host, Chase Green. Happy New Year. I hope that this year finds you doing well. The year 2025, it's hard to believe, but so thankful for another time to reflect on new beginnings and new opportunities as Christians, and I'm looking forward to this season number 9 of the Everyday Christian Podcast. I hope that you've been enjoying the different themes that we have had. I really enjoyed last season with the book of Ecclesiastes, and I'm really looking forward to the topic that I have selected for this season as well, and that is the topic of Christian virtues. This was a topic or a theme that I had for a lot of my sermons that I preached last year at the Marietta, Oklahoma Church of Christ. Not all of the sermons, but a lot of them I tied back into this idea of virtues. So that's what I want to cover this season on the podcast. And we'll begin this week talking about the importance of virtue. I might have some co-hosts this season. I haven't decided fully yet. I know I won't have co-hosts for every episode. Some of these I'll just need to record myself, but I might bring in some co-hosts here and there. So stay tuned for that. But for this episode, it's just me, the importance of virtue. I want to begin by noticing a few scriptures that deal with this idea of virtue, and then we'll talk about why I want to cover this in depth this season. Ruth 3, verse number 11, Boaz says to Ruth, and that's a wonderful book, by the way. I read it recently, and it really shows people of character in Ruth and Boaz both. Anyways, Boaz says about Ruth in Ruth 3, verse 11, "And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you request, for all the people of my town know that you are a virtuous woman." So notice that her character, her virtue went before her, and everyone in the town knew what kind of woman Ruth was. Proverb 12, verse number 4, says, "An excellent wife is the crown of her husband, but she who causes shame is like rottenness in his bones." So an excellent wife. The King James Version says a virtuous woman is a crown to her husband. Notice also the comparison and contrast in this proverb between the virtuous and the one who causes shame. So that would be not virtuous. I think we need to think along those lines. I think back in the old days, the old-timey days, as I used to say when I was a kid, I think that people realized, how serious sin was and how much shame sin can bring upon not only oneself, but his family and whatnot, communities. I think that we're getting away from that as a society. I'm reminded of what Jeremiah said in the long ago about were they ashamed? No, they were not. They were not at all ashamed. Neither could they blush regarding their iniquities. And I think that we're living in a society that is very much that way. So shame is something that should be brought upon sin. Virtue, though, that's character. That is godliness. That's righteousness, and that's what we want to lift up in our everyday Christian lives. Who could forget Proverbs 31, verse 10? That verse says, "Who can find a virtuous wife? For her worth is far above rubies." So those are 3 instances of the word virtuous in the Bible. Now I want to turn our attention to the word virtue. Mark 5, verse 30. Mark 5, verse 30, this is going to be the Old King James Version. It says, "And Jesus, immediately knowing in himself that virtue had gone out of him, he turned him about in the press and said, 'Who touched my clothes?' This was said of the woman who had touched the hem of Jesus' garment. She had an issue of blood over a period of 12 years, and she knew that if she could just touch the garment of Jesus, that she would be healed. But notice the word virtue. Some virtue had gone out of Jesus. Luke 6, verse 19 similarly says, also in the King James Version, "And the whole multitude sought to touch him, for there went virtue out of him and healed them all." Now, if you look at the Greek in both of those verses, it is the idea that Jesus was so full of goodness. He was so full of virtue that there was miraculous power that just emanated from him. He just exuded with this miraculous healing power. It's really amazing to think about. That makes sense when you think about how Jesus, God the Son, is all powerful. He's omnipotent. He's all knowing. He's all omniscient. And he's all good. He's omnibenevolent. And so goodness and healing power just exuded from him. Virtue exuded from him. It's really amazing to think about in that context. Luke 8, verse 46 is another account of the same thing that we read in Mark 5, verse 30, about the woman touching the hem of Jesus' garment. And then I'd like to turn our attention to Philippians 4, verse 8. I mention this quite often when I'm talking about the topic of entertainment. We need to make sure that our entertainment choices pass the Philippians 4:8 test. Philippians 4:8 says, "Finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there is any virtue." So there's that word. That's our buzzword for this season. Any virtue, and if there is anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. Christians need to be thinking about virtue. And then a couple more. 2 Peter 1, verse 3 says, "As his divine power has given to us all things that pertain to life and godliness, through the knowledge of him who called us by glory and virtue." And then 2 Peter 1, verse 5 says, "But also for this very reason, giving all diligence, add to your faith virtue, and to virtue knowledge," and on that text goes. If we were to define virtue, how would we do that? Well, it comes from a Greek word, arete. If we were to anglicize that, it would be arete, arete. And it means, according to Strong's, manliness or valor, that is, excellence, intrinsic or attributed, praise, virtue. Thayer, in his lexicon, defines it this way: a word of very wide significance in Greek writings. I think that's important. The New Testament was written in Greek. The Greeks were very keen on the idea of virtue. So a word of very wide significance in Greek writings. I think Christians need to be keen on virtue too, don't we? Anyways, Thayer continues, "Any excellence of a person in body or mind, or of a thing, and eminent endowment." Remember we said earlier that Jesus was exuding or emanating virtue from himself, and even to the point of his miraculous healing power emanating and exuding from him, so that when the woman touched his garment, she was immediately healed. Well, Thayer says of this word virtue, an eminent endowment. In other words, virtue just exudes from a Christian. It should. An eminent endowment, property, or quality, used of the human mind, and in an ethical sense, it denotes. So here's what this word denotes. So this is kind of an extended definition from Thayer. It denotes a virtuous course of thought, feeling, and action. Virtue, moral goodness. Any particular moral excellence, such as modesty, purity, etc., used of God, it denotes his power. 2 Peter 1, verse 3. So Thayer says that virtue, as it pertains to God, not only does it pertain to his goodness, but it also pertains to his power. And then it highlights 2 Peter 1, verse 3 that we already looked at, according as his divine power has given to us all things pertaining to life and godliness through the knowledge of him who called us by glory and virtue. So it's a fascinating side note to think about. 2 Peter 1, verse 3 shows us that you cannot separate God's goodness from his power. And again, there's power in his word. And so God exudes power and goodness, virtue. He shows us how to exude virtue as best we can. We know we're not perfect, but we should be exuding virtue as best we can as Christians, and he shows us how to do that through his word. Isn't that amazing? I want to talk about the need for this topic of virtues. We live in a society today that has largely lost its virtue. Think about how many good, virtuous character traits society used to take for granted, but not a lot of people have these anymore. Things like honor and a good, hard work ethic, honesty, integrity, gentlemanly behavior, the old word chivalry, and ladylike behavior for that matter, and reverence and respect, and on we could go talking about virtues that used to be praised in society, and now they're hardly taught. We've lost a lot of virtues. The devil loves to have it so. How did it happen? Well, little by little, piece by piece, the devil has slowly stripped away at the moral fabric of our nation and the world. I want you to think about this for a moment. When was the last time you even used the word virtue? Is that something that you typically say in your vocabulary, in your day-to-day conversations, or has it been a while? Maybe you've never really said the word virtue. Again, we talked about how the Greeks, they loved the word. They talked about virtues all the time. I remember when I was a kid, and this is kind of a funny memory, but I remember when I was a kid and going and eating at Chick-fil-A, they used to have in their kids' meals some things about, I think it was the writings of Plato and Aristotle and things like that, but they would talk about virtues in those writings of those philosophers. And maybe I'm misremembering this, but it seems like I remember this, and maybe you remember it too. In the Chick-fil-A kids' meals, they had these little books that would talk about these things, and virtue was an emphasis. When's the last time that we emphasized virtues, maybe in talking about these things to our kids, in telling stories? You remember some of the old fables that kids used to learn about, the tortoise and the hare, and right, there's a moral to the story. There was virtue being taught in that story of the tortoise and the hare. And the moral is this, that you need to be patient. You need to do things the right way. You don't need to be lazy and arrogant like the hare was. And even though the hare could have easily won the race based on natural ability, he didn't, because he was arrogant and he got lazy and he sat down and took the nap. And then the tortoise, through patient dedication, he kept going and he won the race. So there's lots of examples of old stories like that that taught morals, that taught virtues. And I think we need to get back to that. I think of another one, the cricket, or the grasshopper and the ant. The ant, by the way, the Proverbs in the Bible talks about the virtues of the ant and how he is working hard, right? He's not a sluggard, but anyways, the ant, he worked hard all year and he provided for himself. He stored up grain for himself, and then he built his ant nest. And when the winter came, he was safe and secure in his nest. But the grasshopper sang the days away when he should have been working. And when winter came, he was very, very cold. And anyways, he comes and begs at the doorstep of the ant, and the ant says, "Well, I'll bail you out this time, but next year you better work." And I like the moral of that story. It teaches the idea of diligence and work ethic. So virtues, we need to be teaching these things to our young people. If we're not talking about virtues, and again, we've noticed several verses in the Bible that talk about virtues. If we're not talking about it, then are we going to be passing on the good things of God's Word that we need to be passing on, right? Deuteronomy chapter 6, we need to pass on our faith to the next generations. Again, we go back to a society that has lost its virtue, and society has been lulled into such a slumber. The morals of our nation have gone downhill so dramatically. We've come a long way since there was one curse word in Gone with the Wind in the 1930s or 40s, whenever that movie came out. And it was scandalous at the time. People couldn't believe it, that a mainstream Hollywood movie would have one curse word in it. And now you go to the movie theater and you'd be lucky to find a movie that doesn't have any cuss words in it. Most movies at the movie theater today have multiple cuss words. Some of them have hundreds of very, very vulgar words that are in them, as well as other moral filth also. We have lost our virtue as a society. We have lost the ability to blush, as Jeremiah said, and it is truly a shame. Recently, my wife and I and our children, as part of Family Bible Time, we studied through a book by Brother Jeff Miller entitled In the Way They Should Go. I highly recommend that book. We've studied as a family most of Volume 1. There's also a Volume 2 that I'm looking forward to studying as well. But in that book, Jeff talks about how he wants to train all of his children. I believe he has several children. He wants to train all of his children, Proverbs 22:6, in various virtues that are critical for the Christian life. In the book, after the introductory section, he lists a bunch of Christian virtues by chapter, and he talks about the importance of each one biblically and how to train for these virtues and what will happen if we neglect to train on those virtues. I highly recommend the book. You need to get a copy. It's really, really good. You can find it at Apologetics Press, probably Amazon too, but you need to get a copy of this book, especially if you have children. So I got to thinking, I don't use that word virtue, really. And I realized that's a wonderful word. It's a biblical word. I need to be using that. And so after we read that book, we decided, you know what, we need to incorporate this word into our everyday language. And we need to teach our children about all these different virtues that are highlighted in God's Word. So I ended up preaching a sermon series at Marietta on this topic, and it went over well, and I think that it was a good thing for us to focus on as a congregation. And so I thought, you know what, why not focus on this topic for the podcast as well in the year 2025. Again, Peter says that we must add to our faith virtue, 2 Peter 1, verse 5. So this is a very, very important topic. I want to round out the episode for this week by going through a little bit of a mental exercise, if you will, a practice in discernment. Hebrews 5, verse 14 says, "But solid food belongs to those who are of full age, that is, those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil." When's the last time you thought about your spiritual senses? You know, we've got the five senses, the physical senses, sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. Well, what about your spiritual senses? Are they sharp or are they dull? You know, the Bible even talks about those who ears had become dull of hearing, and they had eyes to see, but they refused to see. We don't ever want to be like that. We want to be sharp. We want to be wise. We want to be discerning in our Christian lives. So we need to have our senses exercised to discern both good and evil. And so when we study God's Word, it will help us to do that. So I want to do a little exercise, and I'll call it virtue, vice, or neutral. Virtue, vice, or neutral. And what we're going to do is I'm going to say a word, and hopefully you, the listener, you can think about that word, and hopefully very quickly you can say either that is a virtue, that's a good, righteous thing that the Bible extols, it's a virtue, or you can say very quickly that's a vice, that's a bad thing, it's a sin. Or you might even say, well, this is a neutral thing. It can be good or bad depending on how you use it. So let's do this exercise and let's test our discernment skills. Virtue, vice, or neutral? We'll start with an easy one, lying. Quickly, you know that's a vice, right? All liars will have their part in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone, Revelation 21, verse 8. So we know that one. What about this next one, temperance? That's a virtue. Temperance in the Bible is the idea of maintaining sobriety and self-control. Humility, again, that's a virtue. We know that. What about pride? Pride is a vice. To be proud of oneself is described quite often in the Bible as sinful. Pride goeth before a fall, and a haughty spirit. Pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. What about reverence? Reverence is a virtue. If you ever want to study a good book on reverence, I would highly recommend studying the book of Malachi. What about modesty? Modesty is a virtue. By the way, we're going to be talking about a lot of these this season, these different virtues. Gratefulness. Again, that's a virtue, thankfulness or gratefulness. Gentleness, virtue, right? That's one of the fruits of the Spirit, Galatians 5. Generosity, that's a virtue, right? Having a giving spirit. What about watching television? Watching television. I'm going to say that one's neutral. It can be fine as long as it's done in moderation. We don't need to spend all of our precious time watching television, but occasionally watching television, that's fine. But oftentimes, a lot of use of the television is very much a vice because a large percentage of the television content is really bad. I think there's even a television network called the Vice Channel, which just that ought to make a Christian shudder that they would name a channel like that. But so I'm going to say watching television is neutral. What about using money? Again, that one is neutral. Money can be used for good and bad. We are required as Christians to give a portion of our money, right? 1 Corinthians 16, verses 1 and 2, and other passages. But don't forget that the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. 1 Timothy 6, verse 10. All right, let's make it a little more challenging. Timeliness. Timeliness. Now, you might be tempted, as I was before I read Brother Dave Miller's book, to immediately say, well, that's a virtue. And I think that timeliness can be a virtue, definitely, but I'm actually going to say neutral on this one. And the reason for that is because I believe, as Brother Miller rightly pointed out, sometimes we tend to elevate the timeliness a little too highly. I'll give a scriptural example. Luke chapter 10, the Good Samaritan, right? So the Levite and the priest, evidently, they elevated their time and timeliness. Well, I've got things to do. So they passed by and they ignored the one who had been beaten and left for dead. The Good Samaritan, he stopped and did the right thing. He was a good neighbor. So I'm going to say neutral. I can also think of another example. Brother Miller mentioned this in his book. Sometimes you might have to delay yourself a little bit if your children, and he was in the context talking about parenting and discipline, if your children are not acting right, if they need to be punished, and let's say you're rushing out the door, you want to make sure you're on time for worship service or something, do you just overlook that the child has, I don't know, maybe blatantly disrespected or talked back or has maybe hit a sibling or something like that? Do you just overlook that? Well, we're in a hurry. We've got to be on time, so I guess we'll let them get away with it this time. Or is disciplining the child in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, is that more important in that moment? When I really thought about that, I agreed with Brother Miller. You know what? I think it's more important in that case to discipline the child. So think about that carefully and discern properly on that. He even mentions, I think in the book, Lazarus. Jesus technically was late. John chapter 11, Jesus was late to the situation with Lazarus. Lazarus ended up dying. Jesus had delayed for a few days, I think it was, and Lazarus ended up dying. But of course, we know that Jesus had a purpose for that, right? Jesus had a purpose for not being timely in that particular case because he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead. Maybe that was a trick question. Maybe I was a little underhanded in throwing this one in there. Timeliness, again, I always just generally assumed, yeah, that's virtuous, and I think it is a good idea. But I think Brother Miller makes really good points that sometimes timeliness is not the most important thing. All right, a few more. Rudeness. Well, that's vice. 1 Corinthians 13 says that love does not behave rudely. Lustfulness, again, we know very quickly, hopefully, that is a vice. Jesus said that a man who looks upon a woman with lust in his heart has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Matthew 5, verse 28. Patience. Patience would be a virtue. There's a famous saying about how patience is a virtue. Mercifulness, again, that's a virtue. Just like we want God to be merciful to us, God requires that we're merciful to others. Introversion. Introversion. That is somebody who is naturally a little more shy than others. Introverted. I'm going to say that one's neutral. Now, that's a matter of personality. It's not right and wrong. Sometimes I think people, when they're around introverts and the introvert doesn't really talk much, they might get offended by that. I don't think we need to get offended by that. I think that's a personality thing. Just likewise, extroversion. Some people are a little more high-strung, right, just to say the least, and we need to be careful. I'll just let you in on a secret. I tend to be somewhat of an introverted person myself. Not a full introvert. I can certainly be extroverted in certain situations, especially in one-on-one or maybe one-on 2 or 3 kind of situations. But in big crowds, I tend to be a little more introverted. But anyways, with that, in my personality, sometimes I'm around people who are very extroverted, and I have to be careful not to think too harshly of folks like that sometimes, because it's not me. And when sometimes people are just, very loud and boisterous and extroverted, I get uncomfortable with that. But again, that's a personality thing. As long as the extroversion is not, lending itself towards any kind of sinful activity, then it's a personality thing. And we need to be careful. Extroversion, I would say, is a neutral thing, just as introversion is. All right, what about the next one? You should be able to very quickly decide on this one. Homosexuality. That's a vice, right? Romans chapter 1 and many other verses very plainly show that homosexuality is a vice. It is a sin. That's not politically correct today, though, is it? It's not. But just because something is not politically correct doesn't mean that we should ignore it and sweep it under the rug and pretend like everything's going to be okay. Finally, one more. Let's go with purity. Purity. That's a virtue. Sadly, there are some people who very much malign the idea of purity, it seems today. They say, purity culture, and they act like purity's a bad thing. If you look up the concept of purity culture, I realize that some of the things that were pushed in the very late 90s and early 2000s, some things didn't end up going very well, but that doesn't mean that we should do away with the concept of purity. And I think that there are some who tend to malign the very idea of purity just because some of those folks in that movement did some things that didn't turn out very well. If you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. If you don't, maybe look that up just because it's an important distinction to think about. But purity is a virtue, absolutely. It is a good thing. And we need to push that. The Bible tells us that we must be pure. We could list many, many other things and ask the question, is it virtuous or is it a vice? Or is it a neutral thing? We could list many, many more. As you can see, the potential for a series like this could last quite a while. And we've got 21 episodes picked out as always. And I hope that you'll enjoy this series. We'll see where it goes, but again, I do think that this concept of virtue is a very, very important one. I appreciate you so much as the listener for tuning in to this first episode of season number 9 of the Everyday Christian Podcast with the Scattered Abroad Network. Make sure that you go and check out all the various podcasts that we have to offer. Check out the master feed, Scattered Abroad Network master feed, and you can get every episode that is ever pushed out from all the various hosts that we have. Thank you so much for tuning in, and Lord willing, next week we're going to look at the Christian virtue of graciousness.